to enforce it. If Ukraine still had nuclear weapons, you can be sure that Vladimir Putin would not be invading them today. History keeps teaching that weakness encourages aggression. And history also teaches us that we learn nothing from history. The Ukrainians are seeing it right now. Why can't we see it? Military strength does not encourage war. Weakness does. Senator John McCain recently said of Putin, he's amoral, he's cold, he's distant, he's tough. This week, Germany's Chancellor Angela Merkel phoned President Obama to tell him about her recent conversation with Putin. It's reported that she said that Putin seems out of touch with reality. Sources close to the president said that Merkel characterized him as in another world. Hey, that's kind of scary for the leader of the land of Magog. Certainly, a background of community organizing did not prepare our president for dealing with a man like that. President Obama warned Russia not to move militarily on Ukraine, but what does a warning from the United States mean these days? We draw lines and our enemies dance right across them. In response, we bow and say, we're sorry. Several news outlets characterized the president's comments on Ukraine as tough. Here's an example of his tough speech.
The United States will stand with the international community in affirming that there will be costs for any military intervention in Ukraine.
He could have simply said, there will be costs. Instead, he said, we will affirm with the international community that there will be costs. He's trying to intimidate Putin with the idea that we're going to get together with our friends and affirm that we might do something. Affirm is not a tough word. After layers of disclaimers, he finally mentioned the word costs. But what will those costs be? He doesn't dare say. He doesn't even hint. It's like a frightened kid standing far away from the bully and yelling, you'll be sorry. Then, to show where his heart is, the president went across town to a Democratic Party event where he declared, it's Friday. It's after 5. So this is now officially happy hour with the Democratic Party. The next day, as it became obvious that Russia had begun invading Ukraine, already taking over Crimea, the president's national security team met. But it was Saturday, and apparently still happy hour. Happy hour hadn't ended because Obama didn't bother to join them. In what I believe to be a courageous move, Secretary of State John Kerry agreed to go to Ukraine and show U.S. solidarity with the new government there. But it's probably too late for symbolic gestures. The free world needs leadership and doesn't have it. I believe we're now beginning to see how easily the end times predictions of the ancient prophets can come true. Ezekiel prophesied that Russia and its leader, identified as in Scripture as Gog of Magog, would lead an alliance headed by Iran, identified in Scripture as Persia, to attack Israel. Until now, the world has assumed that America's guarantee of Israel's security was enough to dissuade this kind of coalition or invasion. But now, we see that America's guarantees are worthless and mean nothing to the rest of the world, exactly as the Bible prophets predicted for these days. Since the late 1950s, I've been proclaiming that in the last days of the last days, the United States will fall from being a world power. The Bible describes the geopolitical situation of the last days in detail, but never mentions anything that sounds like the United States. It may still be around in some form, but so diminished from its present position as to be of negligible importance to world events. Bible prophecy clearly teaches that world power will shift to Rome. is from there that a man out of the ancient Roman culture and people will rule the world through a 10-nation confederacy. And his name will be the Antichrist. When I started teaching this 55 years ago, America was on top of the world. Through the years, I watched our country decline. There were times of rejuvenation and good things happened along with the bad. But overall, it's been downhill. For a long time, though, the U.S. decline didn't seem to be fitting with the speed of other end-time events. Then sometime in the 1990s, the pace quickened. The U.S. decline became increasingly obvious. Our decline continued at an ever-accelerating pace. Even though I knew it was coming, the acceleration of decline in the last 5 years has left me utterly stunned. Skydivers use the term ground rush to describe how it feels when they're in free fall and the ground is rushing up to meet them. That's what this feels like. In just a few years, our slow decline turned into a free fall, with the ground rushing up to meet us. The biggest factor in our decline has been immorality. Most of the powerful institutions of America now openly revile God and his followers. That includes government, education, entertainment, and now, judging by recent campaigns, even the business community. The country has openly embraced not just homosexuality, but a plethora of sexual perversions. Another factor is violence. God hates violence. But America not only loves it, but praises those who practice it. And the more aberrant, the better. In the 1970s, we saw shocking violence on our movie screens. But today, most movies aren't as bad as the shows on network television. Ironically, TV critics say that we've entered a new golden age of television. Violence in the streets is beginning to mimic the violence in our games, songs, and TV shows.
Face-off between Russia and the West over Ukraine, a superpower conflict that echoes the Cold War. ABC's Martha Raddatz and Tara Moran both on the scene. Martha in Paris, right in the middle of some high-stakes diplomacy. Good morning, Martha.
It should be tense and frank, especially after that provocative missile launch. Was it a routine missile test or blatant show of force? That is the question many in the international community are asking this morning after Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile launch Tuesday. A test launch fired over the Caspian Sea and landing in a remote part of Kazakhstan. U.S. officials say the missile test had been planned well before the unfolding crisis in Ukraine, calling it a previously notified and routine test launch of an ICBM.
It's time we woke up about Vladimir Putin. It's time that this administration got real.
It's given the orders, they'll fight, and Russia keeps tightening the screws here. As you just pointed out, 2 more anti-missile batteries, Ukrainian anti-missile batteries, now under de facto Russian control. Ukrainian ships bottled up in the harbor by Russian warships. There's no question this whole place remains on a nice edge.
Now to Ukraine, where there were new reports of violence on the ground and late word from the Pentagon that Russian aircraft entered Ukrainian airspace on several occasions in the last 24 hours. There were also escalating verbal assaults between Kiev and Moscow. Thick smoke marked the day's major flashpoint, Slavyansk, where pro-Russian separatists hold sway. A Ukrainian military helicopter exploded as it sat on an airfield, hit by bullets or rocket fire. Later, gunmen in Slavyansk seized a bus carrying international mediators. The separatist leader there claimed a spy for the Kiev government was on board.
I've heard that there was somebody there from the military headquarters. People who come here as observers from the European Union bring a real spy with them. It doesn't look good at all. This is an example of the policy of double standards.
Ukraine's foreign ministry confirmed it lost contact with observers from the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. At the same time, Kiev said government forces were beginning a full blockade of Slavyansk. A day earlier, troops killed several gunmen at a checkpoint there. The Ukrainian military moves prompted a new blast today from Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in Moscow.
Some 160 tanks, some 250 armored personnel carriers are waging war with their own people. This is a bloody crime, and those who push the army to do that will pay, I am sure, and will face justice.
Russian forces were on the move as well in maneuvers. Ukrainian officials claim they had come within 1,100 yards of the border. And acting Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk sounded an alarm.
Military aggression by Russia on Ukraine's territory will lead to military conflict in Europe. The world has not yet forgotten World War II, but Russia already wants to start World War III.
Last night, Secretary of State John Kerry had accused Moscow of fomenting trouble in Ukraine in direct violation of last week's agreement in Geneva.
If Russia continues in this direction, it will not just be a grave mistake, it will be an expensive mistake.
But Russia's Lavrov rejected the criticism today. He insisted the separatists in eastern Ukraine will lay down their arms under the Geneva Accord only when nationalist protesters in Kiev disband their camps. From South Korea today, President Obama said again, the U.S. and European nations are ready to ratchet up the economic pressure on Russia.
What's also important is laying the groundwork so that if and when we see even greater escalation, perhaps even military incursion by Russia into Ukraine, that we're prepared for the sort of sectoral sanctions that would have even larger consequences.
There was fresh evidence that Russia was already feeling the effects of the initial round of sanctions. The ratings agency Standard & Poor's downgraded Russia's credit rating for the first time in 5 years to just one notch above junk status. The S&P warned more downgrades could follow if tighter sanctions were imposed and capital flight from the country was not stemmed.
Сверху смотри, он реально в котловане находится.